Desmond Doss. They claimed the ridge was lost without firepower. He returned with hope. The rope hung over the cliff edge, like a question no one wanted to answer. It was scorched in 3 places where shrapnel had grazed it, frayed at the midpoint where too many bodies had been lowered too fast, and slick with the rain that had started falling an hour before dawn. Private First Class Desmond Doss stood at the base of the towering cliffs of the Hacksaw Ridge, his hands wrapped around that rope, staring up at the plateau 300 feet above. The 77th Infantry Division had spent 2 days trying to hold that ground. Now, in the grey light of May 1945, they were pulling back toward the Pacific coast. The evacuation had been chaos, men sliding down the cliff face on rope lines, some controlled, others barely hanging on. Equipment abandoned. Foxholes left empty. The wounded who could walk had been helped down first, then those who could be carried. But somewhere up there, in the smoke and the rain and the cratered moonscape of the plateau, men were still alive. Doss had heard them calling. Everyone had heard them. The company had lost radio contact with a forward observation post. Lieutenant Briggs. Estimated 6 to 8 men trapped beyond their lines, possibly more in shell holes across the ridge. The numbers didn't matter to Doss. What mattered was the voices. Captain Morton stood 20 feet away, conferring with his platoon sergeants. His face was grey with exhaustion and something heavier, the arithmetic of acceptable loss. Okinawa had been grinding them down for weeks. Every ridge was a fortress. The 77th had taken brutal casualties pushing onto the heights. Yesterday they'd finally gained the plateau, only to face counterattacks throughout the night. Mortar fire. Infiltrators. The screaming chaos of close combat in the dark. At 0400 hours, Battalion had ordered a tactical withdrawal to consolidate positions and await artillery support. Standard operating procedure, logical, survivable, except for the men still up there. Doss watched the last stretcher team descend, their cargo a private named Harrison, who'd taken shrapnel to both legs. Harrison was semi-conscious, muttering about his mother back in Virginia. The aid station corpsman caught the stretcher at the bottom, quickly transferring him to a waiting litter team. Doss knew the system intimately. He'd been part of it for months, moving through the machine of battlefield medicine with his bag of bandages and morphine syrettes, always unarmed, always praying, always trying to be where the voices called for help. He looked up again. The plateau was obscured by drifting smoke and morning mist. Japanese positions were still active up there. Everyone knew it. The withdrawal had been covered by suppressing fire, but that didn't mean the enemy had abandoned their entrenchments. Going back up would mean walking into a contested space with no fire support, no backup, no certainty of anything, except that wounded men were waiting to die. "Doss!" Sergeant Howell appeared at his elbow, voice low. "Captain's about to give the fallback order. We're setting a new defensive line 200 yards down the slope." Howell was a good man, steady under fire, the kind of NCO who remembered everyone's name. He looked at the rope, then at Doss. "I know what you're thinking. Don't." Doss met his eyes. "They're still calling for help, Sergeant." "I know." Howell's jaw tightened. "I hear them too. But orders are orders. We can't hold that ridge without reinforcements. Battalion says we'll have artillery support by 0900, then we go back up in strength. 3 hours, Doss? That's the plan. 3 hours. Doss thought about what 3 hours meant for a man with a sucking chest wound, for someone bleeding internally. He thought about the promises embedded in the red crosses on his helmet and armbands, the promise that someone would come, that you wouldn't be left behind, that being wounded didn't mean being abandoned. Captain Morton's voice cut through the morning air. "All right, listen up. We're moving to secondary positions. Platoon sergeants, get your people organized. Wounded first, then equipment we can carry. Anything too heavy gets destroyed in place. I don't want the enemy using our own supplies against us when they retake the ridge." A pause. "That means everyone. No exceptions. We hold the lower line until Battalion sends us back up with proper support." The men began moving, a tired shuffle of mud-caked uniforms and 1,000-yard stares. Some glanced up at the ridge. Most didn't. Doss stood motionless, his hands still on the rope. In his mind, he heard the prayer that had carried him through every firefight, every desperate scramble through smoke and bullets. "Lord, help me get one more, just one more." Sergeant Howell was already walking away. Captain Morton was organizing the fallback. The rope swayed slightly in the wind, rain running down its length in thin rivulets. Above, the plateau waited, silent now, but not empty, never empty. Doss tested the rope. It held. He began to climb. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and stay with us for the next chapters. The ascent felt longer than it had the first time, 3 days ago, when the company had climbed under covering fire. Now there was no covering fire, just Doss, the rope, and the increasing weight of his medical bag dragging at his shoulders. His arms burned, his boots slipped on wet rock. Halfway up he had to stop and wrap the rope around his wrist for better grip. Rain blurred his vision. Below he could hear shouts. Someone had noticed him climbing. He didn't look down. When he pulled himself over the ridge edge, the full scope of devastation became clear. The plateau was a nightmare landscape of overlapping shell craters, each one filled with muddy water. Shattered tree stumps jutted from the ground like broken teeth. Equipment lay scattered everywhere: rifles, helmets, ammunition boxes, entrenching tools. Doss stayed low, crawling forward on his belly. Visibility was maybe 50 yards through the smoke and mist. Somewhere ahead, enemy machine gun positions were dug into the far tree line. The enemy had held this ridge for weeks before the American assault, honeycombing it with caves and fighting positions that connected through underground tunnels. Even now, after the withdrawal, Doss knew they were up here, watching, waiting, regrouping. The first voice came from his left, weak, desperate. "Medic, somebody, please." Doss angled toward it, moving between craters. He found Private Collins, wedged in a foxhole, both legs shredded by shrapnel. Collins's face was ash-gray, his lips cracked, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. You came back?" Doss didn't answer. He was already working. Tourniquets first, tight and high on both thighs. Collins screamed. Doss whispered apologies and kept working. Sulfur powder in the wounds, field dressings wrapped and tied. Morphine syringe jabbed into the arm, the dose carefully noted on Collins's forehead with a grease pencil. The whole time, Doss listened for movement, boots on mud, the distinctive sound of a rifle bolt cycling. Getting Collins to the cliff edge took 15 minutes of dragging and crawling. Collins helped as much as he could, using his arms to pull himself along, biting down on a piece of webbing to keep from crying out. When they reached the rope, Doss realized his first major problem. The stretcher system he'd improvised during the initial evacuation was gone. He had rope, his medical bag, and whatever salvaged gear he could find. Nothing else. He tied Collins to a length of webbing in a makeshift harness, tested the knots twice, then began lowering him over the edge. The rope cut into Doss's palms, even through his gloves. He braced his feet against a rock outcrop and let the rope slide gradually, hand over hand, praying it would hold. Below, he could hear surprised shouts as soldiers at the base spotted the descending casualty. Hands reached up. They caught Collins. The rope went slack. Doss pulled it back up and turned toward the plateau again. The second man was Private Jackson, unconscious beside a crater with a head wound that had matted his hair with blood. The third was a lieutenant Doss had never met, gutshot and delirious. The fourth was Ramirez, barely 19, trapped under a collapsed sandbag revetment. Each rescue followed the same brutal pattern. Crawl forward, apply whatever medical care time allowed, drag them to the cliff, improvise a lowering system, send them down, return for another. The enemy knew someone was moving on the plateau now. Sporadic rifle fire kicked up mud near Doss's position. A mortar round landed 40 yards away, the explosion showering him with debris. He learned to move during lulls, freezing whenever he heard voices or movement. Once, an enemy patrol passed within 30 feet of where he lay, pressed flat beside a wounded man. He held his breath, one hand over the soldier's mouth to keep him quiet, and waited for the footsteps to fade. By the time he'd lowered the fifth man, Doss's hands were bleeding. The rope had worn through his gloves and was eating into his palms. His shoulders felt like they were on fire. His medical supplies were running low. He'd used most of his morphine syrettes, and his sulfur powder was nearly gone. He tore strips from his own uniform to make bandages. He used his canteen to clean wounds. When a man asked for water, Doss gave him what little remained, even though his own throat was raw with thirst. The rain intensified. Thunder rolled across the plateau. Doss moved like a ghost through the smoke, listening for voices, following sounds of pain and labored breathing. His world narrowed to the next wounded man, the next impossible crawl, the next lowering that might be the one where the rope finally snapped. He lost track of time. Day blurred into approaching dusk. All he knew was the prayer cycling through his mind like a heartbeat. "One more, Lord, help me get one more." At the base of Hacksaw Ridge, Captain Morton stood in the rain, watching bodies emerge from the darkness above. Stretcher after stretcher, wounded men he'd written off as lost. Each one bore the marks of hasty field dressing. Tourniquets tied with strips of uniform, bandages made from whatever cloth was available, morphine dosage scrawled on foreheads in increasingly shaky handwriting. The aid station corpsman worked with controlled urgency, triaging casualties under a canvas tarp rigged between trees. "How many?" Morton asked. Doc Brennan, the company's senior medic. Brennan looked up from checking a chest wound. 11 so far. All stabilized. Whoever's doing the medical work up there knows what he's doing." He paused. "It's Doss, isn't it?" Morton didn't answer immediately. He stared at the rope swaying in the darkness, rain running down its length. The rope that should have been cut and left behind when they withdrew. The rope that one unarmed medic was using to pull off something that shouldn't be possible. "Yes," he finally said, "it's Doss." The captain thought about the evacuation order he'd given that morning. Clear, direct, necessary. He thought about the weight of command, the impossible calculations of acceptable loss versus mission success. The 77th Infantry Division couldn't hold Hacksaw Ridge without reinforcements. That was simply tactical reality. Staying to search for every wounded man would have meant losing the entire company. He'd made the right call. Except Desmond Doss hadn't followed it. And now, Morton stood in the rain, watching impossible results arrive one by one from a ridge command had abandoned. On the plateau, Doss had stopped hearing the prayers as words. They'd become rhythm, breath, the pulse keeping him moving. His vision swam with exhaustion. His hands were so damaged he could barely tie knots anymore. He had to loop rope around his wrists and use his whole arms to control the lowering. The pain was distant, manageable, less real than the voices still calling from the darkness. He found a soldier named Kakdtun, Miller, trapped in a shell hole, half buried in mud. Miller had a sucking chest wound, air bubbling through a hole in his torso with each breath. Doss didn't have proper chest seals anymore. He used the plastic wrapper from a ration pack, pressing it over the wound and taping it down with strips of medical tape. Miller's breathing steadied slightly. "Stay with me," Doss whispered. "Stay with me. We're getting you out." The crawl back to the cliff edge took forever. Miller was heavy, and the mud seemed to grab at them like hands, trying to pull them under. Doss's strength was failing. Multiple times he had to stop, his muscles simply refusing to cooperate. He would lie in the mud beside Miller, gasping, trembling, then force himself up and keep pulling. When they reached the rope, Doss realized he'd lost his last length of webbing. The improvised harness system was gone. He sat there in the rain, his mind trying to work through the problem. How do you lower a man with a chest wound down a 300-foot cliff when you have nothing but rope? and willpower. He ended up tying the rope around Miller's chest and his own, linking them together. Then he began backing down the cliff face, taking Miller's weight on his own body. It was insanity. The rope bit into his ribs. Miller's dead weight threatened to pull them both off the rock face. Doss's boots scrambled for purchase on wet stone. Every foot of descent was negotiated with burning muscles and whispered pleas for strength. Halfway down, Miller regained consciousness. His eyes went wide with terror as he realized they were suspended on a cliff face in darkness. "Don't move," Doss gasped. "Don't fight it, we're almost there, we're almost—" His boots slipped. They dropped 6 inches before the rope caught. Miller screamed. Doss's ribs felt like they were breaking. They reached the bottom in a controlled fall, both men collapsing in the mud. Hands grabbed them. Voices shouted for stretchers. Someone cut the rope binding them together. Doc Brennan was there, already checking Miller's chest seal, calling for a litter team. Doss lay on his back in the rain, unable to move, barely able to breathe. Sergeant Howell crouched beside him. "Doss! Doss! Stay down! You're done! You've done enough!" But Doss could still hear them. Up there, in the darkness, calling. He pushed himself to his knees. Howell grabbed his arm. Don't do this. The ridge is crawling with enemy. You've saved, I don't even know how many." "Not done," Doss managed. His voice was barely a whisper. "Not done yet." He grabbed the rope and started climbing again. Please comment below on what you thought of the story and let us know which city you are watching from. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The 14th man was named Patterson. Doss found him in the last place anyone would look, a collapsed cave entrance on the far side of the plateau, well beyond where American lines had ever pushed. Patterson must have been driven back during a counterattack, taking cover in the only shelter available. Now the entrance had partially collapsed, trapping him in a space barely large enough to turn around. His leg was crushed. He'd been there for at least 8 hours. Doss heard him whimpering, followed the sound through a gap in the rubble. He could barely see Patterson's face in the darkness. "I've got you," Doss said. "I'm going to get you out." It took 30 minutes to clear enough debris. Patterson screamed when his leg moved. Doss had no morphine left. He had no proper bandages. What he had was determination fueled by something beyond rational thought. He used his belt as a tourniquet. He splinted the leg with pieces of broken wood. He whispered prayers and apologies in equal measure as he worked. Getting Patterson across the plateau was impossible. Doss did it anyway. He dragged him crater by crater, taking advantage of every scrap of cover. Enemy positions were fully alert now. Flares occasionally lit up the night. Machine guns swept pre-registered fields of fire. Doss learned the rhythm of enemy patrols, the gaps in their coverage. Once, he lay motionless for 20 minutes while boots passed within arm's reach. Patterson, semi-conscious, somehow stayed quiet. When they finally reached the cliff edge, Doss sat down beside the rope and started laughing. It wasn't humor. It was the sound of something breaking. Exhaustion. Terror. The accumulated weight of the impossible thing he'd been doing for the past 10 hours. He laughed until he couldn't breathe, until tears mixed with rain on his face. Then he tied Patterson to the rope and lowered him down. The 15th man was a soldier Doss had argued with back at base camp, a rifleman named Kovac, who'd made jokes about the medic who won't carry a gun. Kovac had taken shrapnel across his back and shoulder. He recognized Doss through his pain, his expression shifting through disbelief, shame, gratitude. He tried to speak. Doss hushed him. "Save your strength. We'll talk later." The 16th man was already dead when Doss found him. He'd been alive earlier. Doss had heard him calling. Now he was silent, his face peaceful in a way that made Doss want to weep. He closed the soldier's eyes and moved on. There would be time for grief later. Right now, there was still work. The 17th man was Captain Grayson. The forward observer they'd lost radio contact with during the withdrawal. He'd been shot through the leg and had crawled into a foxhole to wait for help that never came. When Doss appeared, Grayson actually saluted. It was such an absurd gesture, two mud-caked men on a death-soaked ridge, that Doss nearly laughed again. "I gave you up, Doss," Grayson said quietly. "We all did. We thought you were dead or captured." "Not yet, sir." Getting Grayson to the cliff took the last of Doss's strength. His vision kept graying out. He stumbled, fell, crawled forward on hands and knees when walking became impossible. Grayson tried to help, pushing with his good leg, but they were both operating on fumes and willpower. At the cliff edge, Doss prepared for the final lowering. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. The rope felt impossibly heavy. He tied it around Grayson, checked the knot 3 times because his mind wasn't working properly anymore. "Okay, sir. When you hit the bottom, tell them I'm done. No more. The ridge is clear." Grayson gripped his arm. "You coming down?" "Right behind you." Doss lowered him. The rope burned through his destroyed palms. He didn't feel it. He didn't feel anything except overwhelming relief. No more voices, no more wounded calling from the darkness. He'd found them all, every single one. The number would come later. 17 men evacuated from a supposedly lost position by one unarmed medic over the course of one impossible day. But numbers didn't matter. What mattered was the silence. The plateau was empty. Doss stood at the cliff edge, swaying, looking out over the devastation. Somewhere in the darkness, enemy soldiers were probably watching him, probably lining up shots. He didn't care. He'd done it. The prayer had been answered. One more. Just one more. 17 times over. He grabbed the rope and began his final descent. His hands gave out 20 feet from the bottom. He fell, hit the ground hard, and everything went black. Doss woke up in the aid station tent 30 hours later. His hands were wrapped in bandages. His entire body felt like one massive bruise. Doc Brennan was sitting beside his cot writing in a medical log. When he saw Doss's eyes open, he set down his pen. "Welcome back. You've been out for a while. Exhaustion, dehydration, shock. Your hands are torn up pretty badly. You'll have scars, but you'll keep full function if you're careful." Brennan paused. "Captain Morton put you in for a citation. The men have been talking about nothing else. 17 rescues. Single-handed evacuation of a compromised position. There's already talk of a Medal of Honor." Doss turned his head away. The tent canvas filtered morning light into something soft and grey. Outside, he could hear the normal sounds of a military encampment. Men talking, equipment being moved, someone laughing at a joke. Life continuing. "There's something they don't know," Doss said quietly. Brennan waited. "The 8th man. Private. I don't remember his name. He was shot through the stomach. I got to him maybe an hour after I started. He was conscious, lucid. He looked at me and said, 'Leave me. Save someone who has a chance.'" Doss's voice cracked. "I told him I would come back. I left him there to find others first. The ones I thought I could move faster. The ones with better chances. I was going to come back." Silence. When I finally went back to that position, maybe 3 hours later, he was gone. Dead. Bled out while he waited for me to keep my promise. Doss closed his eyes. "If I'd stayed with him, if I'd evacuated him first, maybe. Maybe I could have saved 18. Brennan leaned forward. "Or maybe you'd have spent that extra hour with one man who was beyond saving, and someone else, someone who did survive, would have died while you were delayed. Doss, you can't play God like that. You made the best choices you could with the information you had." "I know." The words came out barely above a whisper. "I know that. But I still see his face. I'll always see his face." The real weight of what he'd done was settling now, not the glory of 17 rescues, the memory of the one he couldn't save, the calculations he'd made in the darkness, who to help first, who could wait, who might already be beyond help. Every medic made those calculations, but making them alone, on an abandoned ridge, with no support and no fallback, turned each decision into something heavier than he could fully carry. "They're going to write this up as heroism," Doss continued, as faith and courage, and maybe it was, but it was also just... I kept hearing them calling. I couldn't stop hearing them. Even now, when it's quiet, I hear them. Captain Morton visited that afternoon. He sat on the edge of Doss's cot and spoke bluntly. The after-action report is being written. I'm documenting everything. The unauthorized return to the ridge, the 17 successful evacuations, the tactical conditions, all of it. Command is treating it as an extraordinary act of valor, which it was. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But here's what won't be in the report, Doss. The part where you directly disobeyed orders. The part where you risked not just your life, but the rope line we might have needed for future operations. The part where, tactically speaking, what you did was insane. A rational analysis would say you got lucky, that you shouldn't have survived, and if you hadn't, we'd have lost an experienced medic for nothing. Doss met his eyes. Yes, sir. But here's the other part that won't be in the report. Morton's voice softened. The part where 17 men are alive because you refuse to accept acceptable loss. The part where every soldier in this company now knows that if they go down, someone will come back for them. That's worth something. That's worth more than I can quantify. After Morton left, Sergeant Howell appeared with a cup of coffee and a quiet confession. I was wrong, Doss. When I told you not to go back up, I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was being realistic, but you showed us something we needed to see, that orders and survival instincts aren't the only things that matter, that sometimes the right thing to do is the thing that makes no tactical sense at all. The biggest twist came 3 days later, when an enemy prisoner was brought into the battalion area. Through an interpreter, he told a story about watching an American soldier moving across the ridge that night, alone, unarmed, lowering wounded men over the cliff edge. The prisoner said his squad had held fire, believing it was a trap, expecting a larger force to appear. They'd waited, watching this one man work, confused by his lack of weapons, his deliberate movements, his repeated returns to the plateau. We thought he was a ghost, the prisoner said, or we were being tested. We didn't understand what we were seeing. The interpreter added, he says his commanding officer was so unsettled by it that he ordered the position evacuated. They believed the Americans had some kind of supernatural protection. Doss listened to this second-hand and felt nothing but exhaustion. Not pride, not vindication, just the heavy knowledge that faith, compassion, and stubborn determination had somehow created a legend he'd have to live inside for the rest of his life. The Medal of Honor ceremony happened months later, after Okinawa fell, after the war ended, after Doss had been medically evacuated home with tuberculosis and injuries. He stood in front of President Truman and accepted the medal with bandaged hands that still ached when rain came. The citation was clean, heroic, documented. It mentioned Hacksaw Ridge, the 17 evacuations, extraordinary valor under fire. It didn't mention the 8th man. It didn't mention the fear, the prayers whispered in darkness, the moments when his hands shook so badly he could barely tie knots. It didn't mention the enemy soldiers who'd watched him work and chosen, for reasons they themselves might not understand, not to fire. That was the first big twist of the aftermath, discovering that his survival hadn't been purely miraculous. It had been a combination of faith, skill, confusion, and the enemy's own moral uncertainty about what they were witnessing. The second big twist came years later, at a reunion of 77th Infantry Division veterans. Captain Morton, now a civilian, grayer, quieter, pulled Doss aside. I need to tell you something. That night on Hacksaw, when you went back up, I almost ordered Howell to cut the rope, to strand you up there. The tactical part of my brain was screaming that you were going to get yourself killed, maybe draw fire that would compromise our position below. Doss stared at him. Howell refused, flat out refused a direct order. He said, if you want that rope cut, sir, you'll have to cut it yourself. So I went to do it. I stood there with my knife in my hand, looking at that rope, and Morton's voice broke. I couldn't do it. So I walked away, and you saved 17 men while I was somewhere in the darkness, wrestling with my own conscience. They stood in silence. Around them, other veterans swapped stories, laughed, drank beer, the comfortable camaraderie of survivors. "Thank you for not cutting it," Doss finally said. "Thank you for making it impossible to cut." The resolution came in small pieces over the years. Patterson, the man with the crushed leg, sent Christmas cards every year without fail. Kovacs, who joked about the unarmed medic, visited Doss in Virginia and apologized for every thoughtless comment he'd ever made. Miller, the chest wound case, named his firstborn son Desmond. But the real resolution came in a moment so small that most people missed it entirely. It happened at that same reunion, late in the evening, when most veterans had drifted away. Doc Brennan found Doss sitting alone on a porch, staring at nothing. "Still see their faces?" Brennan asked quietly. "Always. The ones you saved or the ones you couldn't?" "Both." Brennan sat down beside him. "Want to know something? I've been practicing medicine for 30 years since the war. I've saved hundreds of lives, lost some too. And I can still name every single patient I couldn't help. That's not trauma. That's not failure. That's just carrying the weight of caring." He pulled out a worn piece of paper from his wallet. "This is from the 8th man's mother. She wrote to me after the war. She said, knowing you tried, knowing you came back, knowing he wasn't alone on that ridge, it meant everything. She said, tell that medic he gave my son the dignity of not being abandoned." Doss took the letter with shaking hands. "You can't save everyone, Doss. No one can. But you can show up. You can try. You can refuse to accept that acceptable loss is the only option." Brennan stood. "That rope you kept climbing, the men you lowered, that's not just what you did one night on Okinawa. That's who you are. And some of us needed to see that it was possible to be that person." In 1990, 45 years after Hacksaw Ridge, Doss was invited to speak at a military academy. A young cadet asked him what gave him the courage to go back up that cliff. Doss, now elderly, still carrying the physical scars of war, answered honestly. "I don't think it was courage," he said slowly. "Courage sounds like I wasn't afraid, but I was terrified. Every step, every rope lowering, every moment. What carried me was simpler than courage. It was just refusing to live in a world where we abandon our own, even if that meant climbing back up when everyone else said the ridge was lost." He paused, looking at the young faces before him. "The legend says I saved 17 men that night. That's true, and I'm grateful for every single one. But what they don't tell you is that those 17 men saved me too. They gave me a reason to keep climbing when my body wanted to quit. They made the rope mean something beyond just rope. They turned faith into action." His hands, scarred, weathered, still marked by that rope, folded in his lap. The ridge wasn't one with firepower that night. It was one with hope. The stubborn, foolish, beautiful hope that one more person might make it home. And sometimes that's enough. Outside, rain began to fall. The sound of it on the roof brought everything back. Mud, smoke, voices in darkness, the texture of wet rope, the weight of wounded men, the prayer that never stopped. One more. Just one more. They claimed the ridge was lost without firepower. Desmond Doss returned with hope, and in the space between those two truths, 17 men found their way home. We invite you to suggest new story ideas for our next videos. What other historical figures or moments should we cover? Let us know in the comments below.